PDX Real. Community engaged reporting, authentic and unapologetic. We tell you what the news isn't reporting and the politicians don't want you to know. Perhaps you've already noticed that our governing needs your attention. Join the conversation. Find us in both long and short format at these channels. Hello, Portland. I'm Angela Todd. I'm from PDX Real. I have what I think is going to be a pretty amazing little visit with Miss EddyRogoway. We're going to talk today about her experience on the Charter Commission. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Eddy is a criminal law attorney in Portland. Tell us a little bit about how long you've lived in Portland and a little bit about the types of clients you serve.
Sure. I'm a third generation native. My dad was born in Portland 93 years ago. His mom was born in Portland. So I've lived here most of my life other than when I went to college and law school, and I lived in LA for about 10 years. I am a criminal defense attorney, primarily a court-appointed criminal defense attorney. So that's very confusing to people. Essentially what it means is that I serve the same role as a public defender, except I have my own firm and I'm paid hourly by the state. So I have private cases where people retain me, but most of my cases are federal and state court-appointed criminal defense cases. On the state side, I only take murder cases. On the federal side, it's everything from bank robbery to drug cartel cases to major fraud. Those are really probably the top three.
Easy woman to underestimate, I suppose. Murder cases, that's crazy.
I'm very unsuspecting. People are very surprised when they find out what I do for a living.
Yeah. So in November, we voted for ranked choice voting, to my extreme upset.
And a whole lot of other stuff.
Oh, so there was a commission there was an application process in the city of Portland where they asked people, my understanding was they were asking for submittals to be on the commission to determine boundaries that the new city councilors would reside in, right? So right now we have 4 commissioners and a mayor, and now it'll be 12.
Yes, and a mayor.
So talk to us about why you applied or what your thoughts were.
So if I can start with the actual Charter Commission, which was the commission that's appointed every 10 years in Portland to look at the current system of government and to recommend changes. So, of course, everyone was under the impression that the big focus was going to be on changing the format of our government, meaning instead of having commissioners oversee bureaus, which is insanity because people have absolutely no experience. Often they don't have any managerial experience, let alone fire department experience, etc. So what everyone was thinking was going to happen is that they were going to recommend changing that system to be like other like-sized cities and have a trained and experienced city manager, someone who's went to school for policy, who runs the operations of the city, and then have the mayor and the city council implement that policy. But instead what happened is
it's kind of like a school board and a superintendent. The superintendent sort of drives the day-to-day.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect analogy. Under that system, that person who's not elected and who is specifically trained in government functions would be tasked with things like addressing the homeless crisis, etc. But we have this wonky system, and what the Charter Commission did, well, let me back up. I think, reasonably everyone agrees, including the mayor and Commissioner Ryan, that the city council and the mayor were asleep at the wheel through this whole process. They were not involved in who got appointed to the commission. They allowed a woman who works for the city, who has very strong political ideologies, to pick who was going to serve on this commission. And what ended up was that the vast majority either plan on running themselves and or have very, I would say, activist political ideology. And so after this 2-year commission, at the very last minute, they did a bait and switch with what the voters voted in. And the only people on the Charter Commission who had experience in policy, the lawyers, the dean, they resigned because they all adamantly objected. They said, this isn't what we signed up for, what the city has tasked with us. And it was too late by then. And that's why voters, voted in this new system of government, and also a ton of other things that I don't think people even realize.
I felt like for some time we've had discussions about what's broken in Portland, and it started to reach critical mass where people were aware that we needed a new form of government that was outdated. We were at the size of the city we are. Everybody doesn't work in this type of system where, like you said, you vote for somebody and they're managing the water bureau or the fire department and they don't know anything about those things. So I felt as if it was almost like some people who had some ideological preferences came in, funded the charter, and almost fooled a lot of people to think, oh, this is the thing we've been talking about that we want.
100%. And here's what I always say to deaf ears about the danger of activists either being politicians, getting elected, or serving in these roles, is that activists put ideology over what the majority of their bosses want. Their bosses are voters.
Yeah.
People who vote in Portland. That's who they report to. That's who they need to be responsible for. And that's what happened with the Charter Commission. That's what's happened with a lot of
Police Accountability Commission.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is that they're enacting laws, ordinances, policies that directly contradict what the majority of tax-paying voters, or even, tax-paying voters want.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the application process. And I experienced the application process because I thought, you know what, I'm going to apply. And I've applied for different things in the city, and it always feels to me that the questions are loaded so they can ascertain if I have a certain ideological bent. And it feels to me like they will eliminate you if they don't. Do you remember what some of those questions were and your impressions on them?
I remember a lot of like the 2-part questions. One of the part was, and how do you envision, equity or inclusion, being part of this process?
I remember them asking what my credentials were regarding that, or my experiences. So it was something like this. I wish I had it in front of me, and the website's, that part of it's down, because I tried to look it up. It was something like, tell us how you have participated in the community and helped diversity, equity, and inclusion ideas in your community.
Well, and I think part of why I was selected is because some of my experience, my volunteer experience, my career experience, it's hard to dispute as far as, it meets their criteria. For example, I was recognized by the American Immigration Lawyers Association because I organized the lawyers at the airport during the Muslim ban. And, we stopped a deportation. What I do for a living. I represent and advocate for truly the most underserved communities in Portland.
How do you say it?
Indigent.
Indigent.
Right.
That's so hard for me.
Yeah, it is a hard word. And so I think that I had that advantage, but absolutely the questions were phrased in a way for them to
do you rent our own? What's your race?
Right.
I just was like, wow.
Oh, but the best was they asked if I was, what's this? I had never heard of it. Something feather. It's a term for transgender Native Americans.
Yeah. They wanted to know how you identified, and it was
sexually. Like, why do you want to know what my personal sexual preferences are? Or,
Yeah.
And the reason I chose this commission out of the 3 that came out of the charter was because I thought, well, this is going to be impossible for there to be some political bent to it, because it's really just math. It's looking at the city and figuring out where the communities of common interest are.
In the borders.
And finding, approximately 4 of the same sized districts. So I thought, okay, there's not going to be room for a lot of this ridiculousness, this nonsense, and boy was I wrong. I was very not immature, I can't think of the word. Naive. I was very naive about what I was getting myself into. And it's interesting because I'm not going to name who it is, but someone that's fairly high up in the city called me one day after I'd gotten picked. And I haven't talked to this woman in probably 15 years. We know each other very peripherally in the legal community. To tell me how excited she was that I got on this commission and that how she thinks I'm going to serve such a vital role. And I made some joke where, I'm simultaneously honored and terrified at the same time or something like that. And keep in mind, the last time this woman, really knew me, I was a lot younger. And we all know that when we're a lot younger, our political views tend to be different than as we grow up. So I think she assumed that I was one of theirs. And she said, "What do you mean terrified?" And I said, "Well, I've always been, my whole life, a left of center Democrat. But in Portland, that looks to anybody like I'm some right-wing white supremacist. And I'm concerned that people are going to, view me that way based on my opinions."
Yeah, if you don't toe the progressive line, exactly and absolutely, you're one of them.
Yeah. And so this is where this should have been my aha moment. Her response was, "Edie, I can't even imagine how politics would play into this. I'm trying to think about how it could even be political. And I just don't think it's possible." And I knew at that point that I was like, okay, yeah, but I was like, carry on, onward.
Yeah.
And it was so disappointing.
So, spoiler alert for everyone, this story ends with Edie resigning from this commission. Spoiler alert. But before we go there, and before we kind of get into what was happening, I'd like to talk about, I got to tell you, I read a lot about different things going on in the city, and this charter thing has been, ranked choice voting, part of it has been very confusing for me to understand. And I've talked with people that are much smarter than me that also find it quite confusing. And I wanted to know, before we dive into that, if there was anything that you wanted people to know about your concerns about what we voted in and the ramifications of it, or how it's being interpreted right now and what you see.
Oh, I have major concerns. I mean, one of the leading charter commissioners, I think she was one of the chairs, Candace Avalos, ran for city council several years ago, got 9% of the vote, and created this new system. So when she runs again with 9% of the vote, she's going to win, and she's going to get on the council. And they did not prohibit charter commissioners from running. So, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I fought hard and canvassed hard against the charter ballot. Major conflict. I mean, that's just the beginning of the conflict of interest with the city. But I lost my train of thought. For example, because of the police department's collective bargaining agreement, any volunteer commissions or any citizen-based commissions are advisory only. They cannot implement any laws or rules. What the charter enacted, what we voted for, is that 5% of the police budget is now being spent on a commission that has absolutely no power to do anything. I mean, what a complete waste of money. Not to mention the fact that in Portland, Oregon, in May of 2023, is this the most pressing issue? Is it the police that's the reason that we have an unprecedented number of young black boys and men dying on the streets because of gun violence? It's maddening. The lack of prioritizing what matters in this city and how certain politicians are cave time after time to the minority of people in this city who have the loudest voices, the activists.
Yeah, I think that sums up what's happening in Portland. I have a lot to say about the Police Accountability Commission. We had worked with some people at PDX Real that were pulling public records requests on spend. I mean, we're definitely going to get into that. It's quite concerning. Talk to me about who else was on the commission, your impressions, and how the meetings went in general. And I know there's a lot to say there, but however you want to put that together.
There were certainly a few people who I'm still in touch with to this day who I really like, and I feel like were sensible, rational adults. But a large percentage of the people on the commission, I would describe as activists with very definite ideas and views, and wanting to use those ideas and views in how these boundaries are rolled out. Several were extremely young. I'm sorry, call me ageist, or I guess it's the opposite of ageist, but when I was 30 years old, I knew nothing about nothing and would have had no business serving on a commission that is responsible for what is going to be a Portland in perpetuity, right? I mean, I never would have gotten picked back then, 20 years ago.
It takes some wisdom.
Yes,
yeah.
It takes wisdom, and with age brings clarity. It brings an ability to compromise and to see at people's perspectives. I mean, I was in college the wokest of the woke. I mean, I once told my mom that I was not white, I was beige. Okay, to give you some, I protested, I did the whole thing. But we all evolve, except in Portland. That's how I define Portland. Portland is where people, college views stay forever for the rest of their lives, that, or people are so afraid of being canceled or being called out that they really don't believe what they say. They're just saying it, so that they can go along with the flow.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah. So there were a few young women who publicly, for example, we were told time and time again that this was a commissioner-driven commission. We called the shots, we made the decisions, etc. Yet before we had even started, the city employees had chosen the vendors that were going to be working with us, including a vendor that had a very bad history. In fact, the city of Spokane, which I believe is a smaller city than Portland, they used this company when they were doing redistricting their districts, and the volunteer commissioners got so frustrated by how unnecessarily complicated it was, they found their own free app called John's App. FYI, John's App is the app every political consultant and insider uses when they're doing this stuff. But what did we do? We picked a vendor that does not have a good track record and that I would argue has their own political leanings.
Walk me to, you had a lot of your meetings via Zoom, is that right? So, how does the meeting start? Does it start with a land prayer, land back prayer? Talk to me about that.
Interestingly,
I find the city things start that way. No, you're lucky.
I don't recall that happening. I think you can't let me forget the icing on the cake of why I finally had it, because the irony is just next level. So we were given materials in advance by email, the itinerary or agenda, information, and then they told us in the first meeting that somehow they had picked the two first chairs without our involvement. The city staffers did that. So we were told who our chairs were.
So you guys didn't vote on who was going to be the chair. And what were the responsibilities of the chair? To lead the meetings?
To lead the meetings, I think they're privy to information that the entire commission isn't, or at least privy earlier.
Right.
Definitely a leadership role, and a role that will influence what ends up happening. That, to me, it's so obvious. That should have been decided. So the way that they do this is that it's rotating chairs on these commissions, but the commission should have voted in the first two, or at least had a conversation about it. So they're picking the vendors without us, they're choosing the chairs without us, and yet whenever one of the commissioners wants clarification. I was under the impression that this is a commissioner-driven process. They were emphatically, yes, of course, it absolutely is. Oh, and they picked the consulting company that was going to mediate all of these meetings and be our facilitators. A company that also has very intentional, definitive political ideologies. So it was just hours and hours of nonsense. One meeting, they clearly weren't prepared. So this facilitator spent 3 hours of our time reading line by line the materials we had all read and received prior. We were given our own email addresses, city email addresses. So at one point we start emailing about an issue on point that's related to our scope. And one of the city people told us, it's totally not true, that we're not allowed to communicate with each other outside of the meetings because it violates public records law. That's a lie. All they have to do is post our email communication on the website like they do with all the other documents. They have a section that says documents with all the public testimony, the written testimony in it, the agenda, etc. And I replied and I said, can't you just, post them? And they never replied to me. And of course, everyone else, I guess, is assuming, okay,
we'll just go along.
We'll go along. So a bunch of us started working on our own without them. Another commissioner wanted to get ahead of it and asked to meet with the company that's helping with the mapping and made an appointment. The morning of, he got an email that the city aide was coming along. I think that's weird.
Yeah. So is it time for us to talk about what your spinal straw was?
Sure. So I think I participated in 4 meetings before I resigned. 3 of the 4 were 3 hours each. So we're talking, 15 hours of my time. Not a single minute of those 15 hours was spent doing what we were tasked with doing. It was talking about virtue signaling bullshit. Can I swear?
Yeah.
It was reiterating or just constant redundancy, telling us what we already know. And it was the biggest colossal waste of time. But really what was happening is that I was getting so irritated that I would end at 9 or 9:30, and I was crabby to my family. And I just realized there's no point in trying to participate in something that's unwinnable. And right now in Portland, that is unwinnable. When I resigned, I wrote a 1-sentence email to the chairs and the city staffer saying, effective today, I'm resigning from the commission with my name. Not one person at the city followed up with me to find out why.
Wow.
And I copied everybody, the city council, staffers for the different commissioners and the mayor, and nobody bothered, nobody cared. But the icing on the cake, and
wow.
As a Jewish woman who grew up in Portland, Oregon, this sadly is, not as extreme as this, but this is something that I've dealt with my whole life, because when I was a kid, the Jewish population in Portland was way smaller than it is now. And it'd be things like, back to school night scheduled on Yom Kippur. My brother was a good football player in high school, and his coach told my parents that if he didn't play because Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the year for Jews, because the football game fell on the same day as Yom Kippur, that he would be kept out of the game for a few weeks, like stuff like that. So I'm very used to it.
If he didn't
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we would get, there's something like 40 meetings scheduled for this commission, and we would get the notice of the next meeting like 10 days before. There's somewhere we can find out all the meeting days, but that was my system. So about 10 days before a meeting, I noticed that one of our meetings was scheduled for the first night of Passover. So like a dummy, I assumed it was just an innocent mistake. So I emailed the chairs and the staffer and said, hey, I just realized it's on blah, blah, blah. Their response was that it was on me to have notified them of the holiday. And because I didn't do it early enough, they couldn't move the meeting. So I replied back and said, we all know that if this was Christmas Eve or Good Friday or any other Christian holiday, you would not put the onus on the commissioner to let you know of when this holiday is. You're now saying that Jewish citizens have to make a choice between participating in this process and giving public testimony or observing their faith. So they didn't reply to me. They just emailed the entire commission saying the meeting's been moved, never acknowledged it. Start the meeting, they spend the first 5 minutes profusely apologizing to everyone for the inconvenience of having to move the meeting, not explaining why. They never apologized. They didn't even admit anything. So in hour 2 of our waste of time, nothingness meeting, where these young women are, constantly wanting to talk about equity, I finally said, I just find this so ironic. And I said it out loud to the commission. And no one responded.
You find this ironic that during a meeting, they keep talking about equity and including everyone, for example, and you find it interesting that the way that they treated you about a holiday, Passover.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So that was it.
How did that land?
Oh, everyone pretended like I hadn't said it. They just kept. One of these young women wanted to officially complain on the record that I was being disrespectful to the mapping vendor because I asked them if they could tell us about other experiences in other cities where they have done this. Well, I think I asked, have you done this work in like-sized cities with the same scope?
And then what was the result? Yeah.
And she was she was offended by that. So they didn't answer the question, I don't think.
And a while back, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you said that there was some virtue signaling that was always going on at the meetings. Can you give us an example of that?
So probably meeting 3, one of the ridiculous things that the Charter Commission decided is that one of our tasks was to decide if there should be additional criteria in choosing these 4 districts. Very subjective. You see where this is coming. So this young woman, and I find it interesting too, one of the 2 young women who's just constantly is not even a commissioner, she's an alternate. So she doesn't even get to vote unless someone else resigns because they didn't pick her as the first replacement when I left. I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
Virtue signaling, an example.
Yes. So like in week 3, this one young woman is fixated on this what she calls goods and services, which must be some academic term that people learn in college because I've never heard of that. I don't know what it means. Right. So I said, I don't know what that means. Can you explain to me what that means? They really couldn't explain to me what that means. But I paused and I thought about it and I said, well, it seems to me like goods and services are equitably distributed around the city. I mean, if anything, it's in the wealthiest neighborhoods that you don't see stores or bus lines, or when you think of Dunthorpe or you think of Portland Heights, they have less access to goods and services. So I don't know how this fits in. So after spending almost 6 hours on this, the facilitator informs us that it's not something that we're going to vote on regardless for some reason. So it had no relevance to what our task was. She was one of the ones who was always offended. Things like that.
Yeah, and then what is the charter actually tasked with doing? Like even once you left, like what are the core things they're supposed to accomplish in what period of time?
Yeah.
Because I don't even understand that.
Yeah, and before I explain that, I want to add one thing. I absolutely believe that there are certain times and environments where we need to talk about race and we need to talk about discrimination and we need to talk about underserved communities. That doesn't mean that every single task we have for the rest of our life requires that we do so.
That lens.
That lens. And again, the reason I picked this commission to apply for was because I thought it was a very sort of pragmatic job to do. It wasn't sort of out there in the ether. And so what the charter says is that our commission by September 1st has to have at least 9 of the 13 commissioners voting in favor of a map with these 4 voting districts. If they do not do that twice by September 1st, it goes to the city council. And the city council, the one thing they messed up, there's no timeline for the city council. So they, in theory, could sit on it for a year before voting and potentially stall the implementation of the commission.
We can only hope.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's public testimony and public input throughout the process. But they scheduled like 40 in-person. Nobody's going to show up. I mean, I think a total of 148 people to date have submitted public testimony. Probably of the meetings I attended, maybe 3 to 6 people signed up. And most of them were like the heads of neighborhood associations. So they were educated about a lot of the issues and they had their own maps that they wanted to propose. But if the city thinks that there's going to be this outpouring of interest to talk about this nuanced, kind of boring mathematical issue, they're delusional. It's also over summer. I don't know about you, but I tend, in the middle of July not to really be interested in showing up at 7 o'clock at night about some...
On Zoom?
Well, yeah. Now they've opened it to hybrid.
Oh, okay.
But all the commissioners...
But still.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to be in the garden. I want to, yeah.
Oh, and that's another thing. When I got hired or appointed, they told me that there were no meetings in June, but that, all the other months. And I said, well, can I make a suggestion? Because in June, people typically don't travel. The weather's not very good yet. Or they're usually just doing their business. Kids are still in school. But in July and August, it's going to be very hard to get people engaged. So why don't we switch? No. So I guess I don't have any meetings next month, and then they have meetings through, sorry, I'm being fidgety. So what the commission is supposed to do is take the criteria that was created, and this is important because it says to the most possible, it doesn't the expectation isn't to make some miracle happen. The criteria essentially is creating communities of common interest. Doesn't really define that. Very ambiguous. Has to be contiguous, but that can be across the river. That can be sliced in a lot of different ways.
So it doesn't have to be a geographical, all connected.
No.
You could literally grab this pocket and that pocket and say, this is District 1.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the other thing about this commission is we all asked early on for data. I asked for specific voting data because that's what's going to determine communities of interest. They gave us nothing. I asked what the budget is. They wouldn't tell us. I explained that I thought it was a conflict of interest to have the city attorney as our advisors because they serve the commissioners and the mayor, and that we needed someone with specialized electoral legal experience. Mm-hmm. Someone agreed with me on the commission who's a political science professor. They ignored me. So I think it was the fourth of my meetings, the fourth and final meeting, was where they started showing us examples of what we could create, which is they created maps that they want.
Oh no!
And so they have to be generally the same size. So if one's 160,000 and one's 162,000, and it makes sense, it's going to be it'll be okay.
So how did you, my understanding, and my brain can't quite completely do this, we'll have 4 districts, mm-hmm. and we have certain pockets of Portland that probably will vote different ways. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're predictable,
yes.
Which is why you were asking for some of that voter data.
Right. So
so talk to us about pitfalls and what you see as kind of warning signs, assuming that they get their act together for September 1st.
Yes. Well, from the beginning, I said that one of my top priorities was to ensure representation for East Portland, because historically East Portland has been vastly underserved, and East Portland and their political views are quite different than what people assume they are, which is a common Portland thing. A bunch of privileged white people saying that they know what black people and brown people want, which couldn't be further from the truth. So what makes sense based on the voting data that has gone back, I met with a woman who's been a Portland or Oregon politician for probably 20 years, an African-American woman. I'm not going to name who she is, but very well respected, very well known. And she, because she's run for offices, they have their own political mapping people. And she and I, had a meeting before the commission started, and her map made absolutely sense. District to East Portland, the area that everyone calls the Kremlin, and for those who don't know what that area is, it's inner East Portland. I mean, they call it the Kremlin as a joke that this is where, communists and socialists in Portland live. And that's, from the river, I would define it as to the north, probably to maybe Killingsworth, to the south, probably Powell, and then to the east, I would say like 39th. That is the only voting district, and this goes back 10, 15 years, maybe even longer, that votes differently than what the rest of the city votes for. But it's very densely populated.
And they also vote.
They vote.
Oh, they vote.
They vote. Yeah. They vote. And there's more and more of an effort, and it would not surprise me if they enact a new ordinance that allows people under 18 to vote in local elections. Kids, that's the great thing about being a kid. You're still figuring this stuff out, and you're, but I lost my train of thought again. It's a pretty doable task. You've got one area of the west side is not as populated, and so you probably need to add a part of the east side that also, maybe that Eastmoreland area that also represent, votes typically of what the west side does, etc.
And so, like, one strategy, if you were trying to make it so that more of this ideology came in, is you might take that Kremlin area and you might work to divide that.
That's right. And that's one idea. But the other idea is, if this is an area where people, like-minded people, have a community of interest, have the same political ideology, well, then let them have 3 commissioners that represent their interests, but don't have the rest of the city, who doesn't want what they want, suffer as a result.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was so disgusted about after the November election is that I read tweets from not one, but 2 I would describe as legacy reporters who one works for the Oregonian, the other maybe Willamette Week, who both said essentially that the reason East Portlanders voted for Renee Gonzalez is because they were confused about the ballot book and didn't understand what they were voting for.
Oh.
If that's not racist, you tell me what is. I assure you that what they think East Portland wants in this city couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, we purposely got Renee Gonzalez in.
Exactly.
It was on purpose.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's my client. Many of my clients, unfortunately, are young African American men, and I talk to their moms and grandmas all the time. Part of doing what I do is that you kind of have to take in everything, with the client. And I assure you, one of my clients' families is a very large, longtime Portland Black family, and where his grandma, who I love, is like the matriarch, and everything that the Kremlin wants, they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what you hear about people who enact policies that don't affect them. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. They're speaking for other people, and their wishes aren't necessarily consistent with those other people.
Yeah.
And like you said, they don't have to live in it.
Right.
Because that's like some of us in East Portland, we're just like, people have to stop voting for this. We're really having a hard time out here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'd like to close up by asking what your thoughts, like if you had a moment for somebody who's gone through this and sees about the charter, what you might recommend that they do from here, and then also in general what you want to tell people about what's happening in Portland and how they can make a difference.
Well, one of the things that really resonated with me when I started following you is how you emphasize that people need to get involved. And I'm sorry if this is offensive, but for the last 2 years, being heavily involved in what was happening in the city, I will say that Portlanders tend to be lazy voters who don't go beyond what the ballot book, because if that weren't the case, the charter ballot would have never passed, if they actually knew what they were voting for.
Yes.
And people don't get involved. And if 3% of us are out there, organizing town halls, creating political action committees, volunteering to serve on these commissions, while the other 97% of the silent majority, sensible, rational, reasonable adults, do nothing, we are doomed. You have to get involved. There are so many ways you can get involved.
Yeah.
You can participate and help Angela with their town halls and the events that they're having. You can donate money to organizations like the Portland Party, which is a political action committee committed to enacting sensible, moderate, left of center candidates, and that's portlandparty.org. You can canvass for politicians. When there's another election cycle, there'll be candidate forums. You can fundraise for politicians. All politicians want you to have a house party. I think you guys recently had one.
Yeah, we do them. We did one for Renee Gonzalez, and we did one for Julia Brim Edwards, and yeah.
So that's an easy thing that people can do. You get some Costco platters and you invite 30 of your friends and neighbors, so they can learn about these candidates. We did that all of last summer leading up to November, and I have to say, it took a village to get Renee elected. That's the other thing I really would like to see. People who have, I would describe as far left activist ideologies, they're much better than we are at being organized, joining forces. I feel like we are so fractured, like we don't know about each other. So we've got PDX Real doing this, and Portland Party doing this, and Rational Portland doing this. If there was some way, I think maybe some sort of like twice a year forum we had where all the I hate the word stakeholders, like it's so oversaid.
We have a summit we're planning, which I think is going to be really great. And that, yeah,
and that I know that's what Michael Schellenberger, who, for people who don't know, is a very well-known shelter first advocate
who wrote San Francisco.
Wrote San Francisco, and has a very interesting background. He was about as far left as you get. I think he actually went to work with the guerrillas in Nicaragua when he was after college. And he's an academic, he's a PhD, so he's studied the data, he's looked at what works and what doesn't work, and he is starting to bring together people with a common goal and having symposiums. So I'm all in. Whatever you need me to do for your symposium, I want to do it.
Yeah.
But people need to, I think I told you before we started, my dad is 93 and disabled. He testified at county commissioner meeting. My mom is almost 80. She just testified at City Hall. That's another thing we need. So we need people to sign up to testify at the county and at the city. And people need to realize the county has more control and ability and money to get this solved than the city does. The county is who the problem is right now. So I think people need to be more engaged voters, and I think they need to be more engaged citizens.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been trying to think about is, this political thing is just, oh, well, there's problems in politics. You want to get involved, and it's like, oh, dude, I'm busy. Part of it is I was like, you know what, Portland needs this, and we need to get involved, and so to start to make it kind of fun.
Yes.
And I think sometimes people will say to me, often will say, what do I do? I'm like, it depends on your interest. It depends on what you're upset about. It depends on what your skill set is. But starting to show up is part of it. Starting to talk about it to others, starting to show up at events, starting to be aware of what's going on, reading up on what's going on. Rome wasn't built in a day, but just a little bit here and there can make a really big difference. I promise you, though, the more that you find out,
the more pissed you're going to be.
Yeah, and it'll motivate you.
It will, especially because
I'm like a dog.
What I started with when I first, because you have to understand, I have elderly parents who live right in the city, and I have a 5'3", 100-pound daughter who goes to high school downtown.
Yeah.
So I have a lot invested in this, and there are the money, we should do a different show about that,
Yeah.
because I made a public records request about a year ago asking for information about money that nonprofits are getting from the city, and the person that replied said, well, I don't have that data exactly, but here's our link, so you can just plug in any name and find out what, if anything, the city paid. So I spent a morning plugging in the first 9 of the 33 nonprofits that created the 3,000 challenge, the ones who were drastically opposed to Mayor Wheeler's plan to ban camping and to have sanctioned camping. Just those 9, I think, in that year had been paid over $5 million. Most of that in grants, meaning there's no obligation for them to come back and say what they did with it. I learned that, not a large amount, but the city gave some money, COVID relief money, to organizations that have no business getting any COVID funds or taxpayer.
They just started their nonprofit.
Yeah. You're not allowed to create a nonprofit and get a contract to use as your startup cost or a grant. So anyways, yes, you will be very surprised. The other thing I need people to start doing is start sticking up for us when you hear people calling us Nazis or white supremacists or any. It's just nonsense.
Right.
And it's so intellectually lazy. This is when people do it. People who don't have an argument or who know their argument is deeply flawed, the new thing to do is just say, well, you're a racist, even if it has nothing to do with race, because people get afraid of being canceled and they shut up. Well, we need to stop that, and we need people to be brave. It can't just be me and Angela doing it, you know? Right. And this one has really stuck her neck out there. And, if there were more of us, it would be less likely that we're going to get attacked.
It would stop if more of us.
There's power in numbers.
Right.
And that's what Jessie Burke, who's the head of the Business Association in Old Town, who's phenomenal.
Owns the Society Hotel.
She is a force unlike anybody. I mean, that woman has more talent in her pinky than I think I do in my entire body. But she organized. She got all of the people, the businesses in her community, to be part of it. She put together a plan. She knew how to work effectively with the mayor and the commissioner. And I want to say, by the way, I'm pretty sure the mayor is currently getting laid, because he is the only one in this mess who's actually doing something and is willing to be brave and speak out. So whoever you are, on behalf of a grateful city, thank you, lady. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And thank you, Mayor Wheeler.
I'm a little bit behind on my content right now, but I wanted to do one last night that was like, the mayor is a baller. I mean, he grew a pair. Like I heard from a very reliable source that was in the meeting that he was in a meeting with the county. It's been reported. Yeah. But he just was like, I'm cutting you guys off with the Joint Office of Homeless Services unless you give me, $20 million. Yeah. Like, I'm done. And in a way, I wish that would have happened a year ago. Yeah. But I'm so thankful. Yes. I'm so thankful that he gets it. And I can't help but believe that it's because he's getting support from us. Yes. That he is understanding. This is the thing people they overlook in terms of testimony and letters and being out there and sharing things and putting out content, is that it tells the politicians that they have strength in numbers too.
Yes, that's right.
We need to stick up for them too.
Yes, and stop believing what Nicole Hayden at the Oregonian writes, or some of these other young reporters. I mean, I know I keep honing in on age, but what do you expect when you have a very young person who has very strong ideological beliefs, who's tasked with writing the narrative about the Portland homeless crisis? It is incredibly biased and one-sided, and it's not true. Here's the other thing I will say, is that Jessie did a great job of explaining that when you hear people like Kafuri or Jolin, don't get me started, talking about...
Jolin used to be the director, the head of the Joint Office of Homeless Services. Right. It's Mark Jolin, yeah.
When you hear them talking about successes, they are talking about a completely different population than what you're seeing on the street. They are talking about people who want case management, who want help. They're talking about the woman who fled domestic violence, or the man who lost his job, or families. They are not talking about the crisis on their streets. And so that's why you feel constantly gaslit whenever there's a press conference. Thankfully, our courageous mayor, he's not doing that. He's speaking honestly about what the problem is and the causes and all of that. So I just really thank him, and I really thank his lady, whoever you are.
Miss Edie didn't disappoint. Join us next time, and we got to have you back to talk a little bit about those public records requests.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.